Japanese authorities have admitted the crisis at the Fukushima nuclear plant in March may have been worse than a core meltdown. In an official report that will go to the UN's nuclear watchdog, Japan says nuclear fuel in 3 reactors possibly melted through several pressure vessels and into the earth below. 3 months on, it does seem that not only does the news continue to get worse, it's a constantly changing scenario, a sort of drip feed, if you like, of information. Does that tell you that this government is really struggling to, I guess, assess the extent of this disaster and also the extent of the risk?
Well, I think it's a combination of both, really. Initially, there was a paucity of information released, and we thought that that was originally due to the fact that they just didn't have the information to hand. But as time wore on, we realised that a lot of it that was being drip-fed to us was known to the government, to the Japanese government and to the Japanese regulator from early on, and it just was not being released. Of course, you can't institute countermeasures or introduce proper public health or make proper public health decisions without timely information, and this is the risk that the Japanese people have faced.
So what do you think was known and not being released, and how did you yourself know that?
Well, we know that there's a system called SPEEDY in Japan, which is an atmospheric monitoring system for radioactive discharges. It's throughout Japan, and what it does is it assesses the levels of radioactivity at any particular point, combines it with the meteorological data, and determines what the likely doses, or rather what the likely contamination levels at any particular area are, and further over time you can integrate back and determine the overall burden on that particular part of the country. Now this is run by the government. The data for 2 months following the disaster was concealed from the public, and only in early May did they concede that this was an error, and they were prepared to release the data, and you can actually go to a website now and see what it is. Now, they knew the data, they knew what the likely contamination was, and furthermore they knew the isotopes at the time, so they could say firstly that the cores were damaged, the spent fuel ponds were probably involved, and also they could determine the estimate of the burden. The argument they used in May as to why they didn't reveal this information was that they didn't want to panic the population. I mean, this is absurd. I might add that the Austrians, who used the CTBT monitoring data, the test ban treaty stations in the Northern Hemisphere, they determined within the first week or 10 to 10 days that the contamination levels around Fukushima within 20 kilometres were probably going to be higher than that of Chernobyl. Furthermore, they could calculate using their computer modelling out to what the contamination levels were going to be out to 200 kilometres. Now this is the Austrians. The Japanese had much more reliable data, and yet they concealed it from the public by their own words.
What about other health impacts? How soon would you expect them to start to show up, and who is most vulnerable?
Well, the most vulnerable are children. Children, particularly infancy, 3 to 4 times the rate of induction of cancer. Women are 1.5 times more likely to develop cancer than men for similar doses. But as I said, these will take some time to manifest. And if we are ever able to detect them, unless the proper studies are instituted. I might add on that point, with children, the government has actually raised the public exposure, public dose limit threshold from 1 millisievert per annum to 20 millisieverts for children outside the exclusion zone. The reasoning being that they didn't want to evacuate them because then they would be deprived of their education and so on. But it's an absurd proposition. They're posing unnecessary risks to children. In fact, there's a worldwide campaign at the moment by medical practitioners to get the Japanese government to reverse this absurd decision. Furthermore, the Japanese government's scientific advisor resigned as a consequence of that decision.
And Peter Karamoskis, will the people who have been evacuated, will they ever be able to go home?
I find the Japanese government's comments that this is somehow a temporary situation and these people will return a little bit puzzling, because we know that the levels of contamination in many places are comparable to those of the Chernobyl exclusion zones, which still apply 25 years later. These areas will be or are so highly contaminated, as we now know for certain, that it's unlikely that these places will be inhabitable for 200 years, say, at least, and so, particularly until the cesium decays to a safe enough level. The iodine has gone, the cesium has not. We're looking at 200,000 people. These people will not be going back home, and furthermore, this area will not be arable countryside. There's a lot of agriculture in the area as well, beef and so on. These industries have been wiped out, not to mention, of course, the fish stocks, that what survived of the tsunami and earthquake of the fishing industries there has been wiped out by the contamination and the radioactive contamination of the food stocks there.
地域においてはですよ、人間もそしてその家畜やペットたちもワンコや猫もですね、ちゃんと戻れる時が来ますから、だから例えばペットを救うことも大事だし、一時帰宅じゃなくてみんなが戻れるようにすることも大事です。チェルノブイリとは違います。戻れないわけじゃない。
それ期間的にはどのぐらいですかね。
だからテリーさん、それは今現場で作業を積み上げていってるんで、地域の方は気にされるのは分かりますけれども、来年1月というふうに思い込まないでください。その時期が来年の6月にずれても、あるいはそれ1年かかっても確実に戻る方が大事です。そういうことにごまかされないのが大事です。